Okay, thank you all for being here. Dr. Yonatan Brafman is Assistant Professor of Jewish Thought and Ethics and the Director of the MA Program in Jewish Ethics at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. His research focuses on the intersection of Jewish thought, Jewish law, and contemporary moral and legal philosophy. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Can everyone see my shared screen?
So.
Okay, just the screen, not my notes. That's good, right? All right. The conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd represents a moment of justice. But such moments for Black and Brown Americans are all too infrequent. So it also represents a moment to collect ourselves as a Jewish community in order to confront the racism and inequality that's prevalent in our society. So tonight, I want to begin and I want to discuss kind of 4 orienting questions. And I want to also set our goal for this evening. First and foremost, I want to ask, what can Jewish textual traditions and historical experience contribute to our reckoning with racism? Right. I want to focus both on textual traditions, so classical Jewish texts, as well as Jewish historical experience, even recent historical experience. It's kind of a sub-question of that. I want to ask, how has the Jewish tradition been read in both egalitarian and in discriminatory ways? And what I want to stress here is our responsibility for our tradition. Our tradition doesn't say one thing, and thus what we make of it is something that we are responsible for. Another sub-question, how can modern Jewish thinkers contribute to our diagnosis of racism? We often don't think of modern Jewish theologians or philosophers as discussing racism, but I want to suggest that there are some resources there. Finally, what can Jewish debates about reparations from Nazi Germany teach us about the issue of reparations for slavery and its legacy in the United States? I want to stress, and I'll stress again and emphasize in a few moments, that what I'm doing here is not comparing atrocities of genocide and enslavement. Rather, what I want to do is to learn together from responses to atrocities. My goal tonight is episodic as opposed to exhaustive. We're going to kind of move through 3 episodes: classical biblical text, Jewish thinking about racism, and then the question of German Jewish and American reparations. Right, through those 3 episodes, we're not going to exhaust these issues. Rather, what I want to do is to set up a discussion. I want to provide entry points and setting an agenda for a discussion rather than ending it. I'm not going to be descriptive or directive, because that's not how I think moral reasoning works. We reason together ethically as a community. I see myself as facilitating that, not as ending it. So here's our roadmap for the next while together. First, we're going to look at human variation in classical Jewish texts. Human variation just means the way in which humans look and are different than one another. The way our skin tone is different, the way our hair texture is different, the way that we're taller or short, or have different organs. How did classical Jewish texts understand human variation? Then we're going to look at Jewishness and the theorization of race. We're going to turn to some modern Jewish thinking about race and racism. Then we'll turn to the question of reparations and Jewish experience, and to think about how the question of German Jewish reparations can enlighten or illuminate our own conversations as Jewish Americans about reparations for African American slavery and discrimination. I'll close by not posing any conclusions, but by posing some reflective questions, as well as providing some suggestions for further reading, some of which I'll make use of in my presentation tonight. So let's begin with human variation in classical Jewish texts. And I want to lift up 2 themes at the outset: equality and difference, because there is a recognition that there can be a recognition of difference that exists within a framework of equality, while there is also a way to focus on difference to the exclusion of equality and even to promote inequality. One of the greatest texts of the Jewish tradition is early on, Genesis 1:27, where it says, "And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Here we find the idea of tselem Elohim, of the image of God. We also see a very interesting relationship between singularity and diversity. right? And God created man, singular, in his image. In the image of God, he created him, singular. Male and female, he created them, plural. And so there's this indication, even in the initial biblical text, that there is in some ways in which creation is singular, and there's another in which it's diverse. Here, diversity of genders. The rabbis were attuned to these nuances of the text. In the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, where it discusses the warning that the rabbinical court would give to witnesses before they testified in capital cases, it says as follows: Adam was created alone. God created one human being instead of creating 5 or 10. Why was that? And this was due to maintaining peace among people. So one person will not say to another, "My father is greater than your father." The rabbis say that God created one human being. The human being was created singular so that we would all have a common origin. And we couldn't say that we have a diversity of origins. And so one of us is greater or superior to the other. Human beings are thought to have a common origin and a common value. But this is not to wipe out all human variation. It continues, and this serves to tell of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be he. As when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they're all similar to each other. But the supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first man, and not one of them is similar to another. When human beings stamp something, right, the stamps all come out the same. But when God, blessed be he, right, makes a stamp, they're all different. Even though God created Adam singularly out of one stamp, human beings are various. We look different than one another. We have different colored skin, we have different colored hair and texture of hair, of height and weight, and so on and so forth. But all of this is seen in Genesis 1:27 as interpreted by the rabbis in Sanhedrin as compatible with a basic human equality, all of us in the image of God. This is a deeply moving text, which allows us to support egalitarianism and to militate and mobilize against racism. But it's not the only voice within the Jewish tradition. And in order to be responsible custodians of our tradition, we need to square up to the difficulties in this text, in this canon. And so now I'm going to turn to a much more difficult text. Following the story of Noach and his children in the ark, they emerge from the ark and Noach famously gets drunk. He is naked in his tent and his son Ham sees him. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. So Ham sees his father naked and drunk in the tent and goes and tells his brothers Japhet and Shem. Japhet and Shem go and cover him respectfully. But because of his disrespectful treatment of his father, Ham is cursed. Or perhaps Ham's son is cursed. And this is one of the ambiguities I want to point out in this text. It says, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. May God enlarge Japhet and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to them." I want to point out an initial ambiguity. Ham is the one that sees his father naked in the tent, and yet his son Canaan is the one that is cursed. We'll see that this is not the only perplexity in this text and its interpretation through the ages. In Genesis Rabbah, there is a debate about why Ham or Canaan is cursed, what the actual act was. And there's also a switch of what the curse is. As we see in the text of Genesis, it is to be a slave. Rav Huna and Rav Chia associate with something different. Rav Huna also said in Rabbi Yosef's name, "You have prevented me from doing something that is done in the dark. Therefore, your seed will be ugly and dark-skinned." Rav Huna thinks that Ham can't be punished simply for seeing his father naked. He must have done something else. What Rav Huna thinks Ham did was to castrate his father. And so Noach says, "You prevented me from doing something that's done in the dark, having sex, and therefore your seed, your children will be ugly and dark-skinned." We see this association of being dark-skinned with a curse in the mouth of Rav Huna. Rav Chia has a similar view of being dark-skinned, although he thinks that there's a different sin. Rav Chia said, Ham and this dog copulated in the ark. Therefore, Ham came forth black-skinned, while the dog publicly exposes its copulation. Many rabbinic interpreters believe that Noach, as well as his children, as well as all the animals, were forbidden from having sex while in the ark. Most of them abided by this, but Ham and the dog violated it, and they were both punished. Ham was punished, according to Rav Chia, by becoming black-skinned, while the dog is cursed in the manner that dogs have sex. I don't have a dog. I don't know what's so bad about the way dogs have sex, but Rav Chia thinks it's bad. The point here, though, is that Rav Chia thinks that Ham is punished for having sex in the ark, and he's punished by having his children become dark-skinned. All of this seems like a total non sequitur, as it is in the biblical text. Right? There is no mention of dark skin. There's no mention of castration. There's no mention of having sex in the ark. What is going on here? I'm going to add further questions before we resolve it. The Talmud in Sanhedrin follows Rav Chia's interpretation and adds to it. The sages taught 3 violated that directive and engaged in intercourse while in the ark. There are 3 beings, not just 2, who violated the directive that you couldn't have sex in the ark, and all of them were punished for doing so. They are the dog and the raven and Ham, the son of Noach. The dog was punished in that it's bound, and I think this means it's bound while it's having sex. The rabbis think that dogs once they initiate sex, can't remove. I have no idea again. The raven was punished in that it spits. Apparently ravens spit. And finally, Ham was afflicted in his skin. Right? We see here the sages in the Sanhedrin, right, move very quickly from this idea. The biblical talks about slavery. It also talks about Canaan being killed, being cursed, right? And then move it to Ham being cursed and identify it with being dark-skinned. Rashi adds to this, was afflicted in his skin, because the Talmud doesn't even say what the affliction is. Rashi adds, for Cush descended from him. And Cush for Rashi is a place in Africa. There's this association of the curse with becoming dark-skinned like those from Africa. What is going on in this text and what is going on in its rabbinic interpretation? David Goldenberg, in his magisterial book, The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, provides us with a path for understanding it. It's clear that the biblical context for the curse of Ham and then the curse of Canaan, where Canaan is cursed to be a slave, is the biblical context of the conquest of Canaan. The Israelites are soon, in many generations in the biblical telling, to inherit the land of Canaan. And this story in Genesis is saying, why did Canaan merit to lose the land and for the sons of Shem, for the Israelites to inherit it? And this story is supporting the fact that Canaan is to be a slave, and it has to do with kind of intra-land of Israel politics. However, once we get to the rabbinic context, right, when we leave the biblical text and move to the Midrash, the Mishnah, and the Talmud, right, we're not in the context of the conquest of Canaan anymore. The rabbis are concerned with what Goldenberg calls, and here I'm going to lay out some complex words and then unpack it, somatic norm preference. Kind of cross-culturally, people like the way that they look and think that that is normal and try to come up with some sort of explanation for the way that other people look. The rabbis of the Midrash, the Mishnah, and the Talmud were Middle Easterners with the skin type and the features of people in the Middle East. And they were trying to understand, why do other people look differently? They preferred the way they looked. They thought that that was normal. And so they're telling a story about the curse of Ham, right? Not Canaan, of Ham, which is going to account for why people are darker than them. And we see in other places, they have accounts for like why people are much whiter than them, right? They're trying to provide some sort of interpretation, some story for why people are darker with them than them. We see in the shift of context, we can account for some of the strangeness in this text and its interpretation, right? In the biblical text, Ham sins, but Canaan is cursed. And that makes sense because this is all meant to support the conquest of Canaan. But the rabbis associate with Ham because they're trying to understand why people look different than them. We're not even sure about what was the sin. Was it seeing or castrating Noah, or was it for having sex in the ark, right? The different sins, right, are connected to what are you trying to explain? Who is cursed again, Canaan or Ham? In the biblical text, it's clear that Canaan's cursed, but in the rabbinic text, it's Ham that's being cursed. Right? Again, it's because they're trying to understand human variation, not why the Canaanites deserve to be expelled. And finally, and as we see when we turn to Rashi, what's Cush got to do with it, right? Where does Cush feature in this? Rashi is living in the Middle Ages where African slavery is prevalent. And so he is trying to understand the biblical text, which talks about slavery, the rabbinic text that talks about darkness, and combining it with his pre-accepted notion that dark people from Africa are slaves, right? And that's only because he has the social institution of African slavery. And we see this in the different punishments. In the biblical text, it's slavery, but in the rabbinic text, and then in Rashi's text, it's blackness. Slavery in the biblical text comes to equal blackness in the rabbinical text, is then associated with Ham overall to create what we think of as the curse of Ham. The curse of Ham has been used by Jews, Christians, and Muslims in order to give a theological prop for African slavery. Goldenberg writes, the curse of Ham in its various forms becomes a very powerful tool for maintaining the existing order in society. The biblical text does not mandate slavery, only the slavery of Africans. Only after the enslavement of Africans becomes prevalent in the Middle East and Europe is the connections among slavery in the biblical text, blackness in the rabbinic text, and Ham as kind of the racial origin for slavery. Only later is that forged. We see in comparing the idea of Tselem Elokim and the value of human difference with this discussion of the curse of Ham in the rabbinic tradition, the polyvocality of the Jewish tradition, the way in which it has all these semantic, all of these textual potentials, and it's our responsibility to interpret it and enact it in the present, either to support injustice or to promote justice. I want to now jump several centuries to explore how racism is theorized by modern Jewish thinkers, though I'll return by the end to the curse of Ham, because I think that these Jewish thinkers give us a good category, a good way of diagnosing what's going on here. I want to start with hacking out some vocabulary, right, and comparing racial theory and critical race theory. Racial theory is a 19th century invention. It's a pseudoscience. It takes human variation, the way in which human beings do differ from one another in skin tone, in hair texture, in height, in weight, in facial features, but how this exists in a spectrum. Racial theory takes that variation and says this spectrum of variation indicates discrete categories or kinds of people. Right? And these categories attest, the racial theorist says, to immutable differences, unchanging differences. These differences, the racial theorist claims, can be traced back to differences of origin, people from Europe or Africa or Asia or North America or South America. Right? And these discrete and immutable categorical differences of origin, the racial theorist says, mark a superiority or inferiority of value. There are higher and lower races, the racial theorist says. And this differences of superiority and inferiority of value licenses disparity of treatment because certain peoples are better than others, certain races are better than others, we can treat them differently. In a word, it licenses injustice. Critical racial theory, just to deflate a term, is just realizing the pseudoscience of racial theory. It's recognizing that racial theory is false, that race is constructed, that it takes a spectrum of human differences and imposes this structuring upon it, right? It recognizes that race is constructed for political purposes rather than discovered by some type of racial science, that racial science is pseudoscience. Albert Memmi, who many of you I imagine have not heard of, I had not heard of him until very recently, is a Jewish critical race theorist. He was born in 1920 in Tunis and died very recently in 2020 in France. And his identity attests to the productive work of critical race theory. He was North African, of Berber descent, but also of Italian and French descent. He was also a Jew. He had a complexity of ethnic background. He was educated in a Francophone context in the University of Algiers and the Sorbonne, and he worked as a teacher, novelist, and philosopher. He was an advocate of Tunisian independence against French colonialization, yet he recognized his precarious position as now a Jew in a Muslim-majority North African country. He realized that at one and the same time, in the French context, he was a North African, and in the North African context, he was a Jew. And the way in which these identities were complexly interwoven with one another and licensed in others' eyes all sorts of differences. He wrote many works which I recommend to you, including The Colonizer and the Colonized in 1957, The Liberation of the Jew from 1966, and the aptly titled Racism from 1982. And it's this work, Racism, that I want to discuss very briefly with you in the next few moments. In Racism, Memmi gives you what you want out of a modern Jewish thinker. He gives you a theory of racism. What is racism? For Memmi, racism is a subgenre, a subtype of a larger category. The larger category being what he calls heterophobia, fear of the other. He writes, heterophobia would designate the many configurations of fear, hate, and aggressiveness that directed against an other attempt to justify themselves through different psychological, cultural, social, or metaphysical means, of which racism in its biological sense is only one. The basic idea is that we have a human phenomenon of people being fearful of other people, of hating other people, of being aggressive towards other people. And then people provide justifications or apologies for why they fear, why they hate, why they're aggressive towards other people. These explanations, these justifications, these apologies can take psychological form, cultural form, social form, or even metaphysical form. When we see other people as being biologically different than us, and therefore, it being appropriate for us to fear, hate, or be aggressive towards them, that is racism. Racism is the justification of oppression by appeal to purported, fictitious biological facts. He writes as follows: racism is a generalizing definition and valuation of differences, whether real or imaginary, to the advantage of the one defining and deploying them, and to the detriment of the one subjected to that active definition, whose purpose is to justify social or physical hostility and assault. That's a mouthful. I'm going to break it down in the next slide. For Memmi, racism is a specific form of social oppression. There are all sorts of ways that people oppress one another. We tell people that people speak another language than us, or they're poorer than us, or they come from a different nation than us. Racism is a specific form of social oppression focused on purported or imagined biological differences. But Memmi points out that racism is a social discourse, meaning when we oppress one another's, or we hurt one another's, or we exploit one another, we are able to do that because of the way that we think and talk about them, right? So what is that way that we think and talk about them? We see ourselves as dominated. and the other as the subject. We feel feelings of aggression mixed with fear. If we look, Meme argues, as the way in which those that aim to dominate others talk about, right, those which they try to subject, there's this mixture of both aggression and being fearful of them. The way that we talk about these others that we oppress provides a rationale for injustice and a defense of our own privilege. We say we can treat them this way because they're like this. They are inferior to us culturally, biologically, economically. It provides an apologetics for our own domination, including a self-justification of us being in the privileged position. Racism aims at the social destruction or the nullification of the victimized people, right? We aim to destroy their communities, their lives, to nullify them for the benefit of the persecutors, in order to benefit, right, those who are in the dominating position. And again, the way in which we're able to justify this to ourselves is because we have disparaging myths and images of those dominated people, because we propagate either biological or cultural explanations for why we are in the privileged or the dominating position, and they are in the subordinate and subject position. Meme writes, racism reaches its apogee in metaphysics and in religion. What I want to suggest is that this is evident in the development of the curse of Ham, right? The biblical text as it's taken up by the classical rabbis and as further developed by Rashi. And we can point to modern Christian and Jewish thinkers in the 19th century who use this text as well. We provide a story back in the days of yore, which licenses the enslavement of Black people. I am not trying to condemn the Jewish tradition. I am deeply in love with it, and it guides my life. It has things like the Tselem Elokim. It also has things like the curse of Ham. What I want to suggest is that we are responsible for our tradition, which contains both the curse of Ham and the image of God. Will we use our tradition to rationalize social oppression or to challenge it in the name of justice? I want to move now from Jewish text to Jewish experience, and from responsible reading to responsible doing by exploring reparations in Jewish history. I want to emphasize again that I'm not comparing atrocities, genocide and enslavement, the enslavement of African Americans, and the Holocaust of European Jews. I think that that's a foolish thing to do. I think that there's a certain level of atrocity beyond which our minds begin to swim, and it's something like multiplying infinities. There's really nothing to say. Rather, what I want to do is to compare the responses to atrocities and what we can learn from these responses. The contemporary debate about American reparations builds off of efforts in the 19th century and into the middle of the 20th century. But recent debates really get started with Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations. Coates makes three major claims, which I'll briefly discuss. The first is about the scope of reparations. What are we talking about? What is the injustice against African Americans, about Black people in America, that we think justice must be made right? We are not, Coates argues, just talking about the fact that people were enslaved. Firstly, we're talking about slavery and the way in which it laid the economic foundations of the USA. That American history and its development to being the global power that it is today cannot be disentangled from the institution of slavery. Second, slavery didn't end, but it morphed into Jim Crow, what he calls neo-slavery. Finally, even after the fall of Jim Crow, it continued through discriminatory policies against Black people through federal housing policy and the practice of redlining. So what we're talking about reparations for is not something that happened long ago, and in the South, it's something that continues into the 20th and 21st century, and that is implicated in the foundations of our country. The second major claim that Coates makes, which is very important for us, is to disambiguate distributive and corrective justice. The distinction between distributive and corrective justice goes all the way back to Aristotle. Distributive justice asks, for all the goods that there are in our society, how do we distribute them justly? Who gets what? How do we provision healthcare in a way that's just? How do we distribute the wealth of our country in a just way? Corrective justice, in contrast, has to do with how do we right wrongs? When someone has harmed another, either bodily, socially, or materially, how do we right that wrong? For Coates, we need to disambiguate, we need to distinguish between distributive and corrective justice. There are all sorts of good and proper policies that we should have in this country. Maybe income inequality, maybe healthcare. Maybe we should rectify income inequality. Maybe we should rectify healthcare inequality. These are questions of distributive justice. They are separate from righting the wrong of slavery and discrimination against African Americans in this country. Lastly, Coates argues that if we focus on that issue of corrective justice for slavery, on reparations, we should need to focus on it in principle, even if we haven't gotten the practicalities all sorted out. He writes, reparation, by which I mean the full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences, is the price we must pay to see ourselves squarely. There are many complicated questions about who should pay and how much. But first of all, we need to recognize that a harm was done, that there is an injustice that needs to be corrected, and see ourselves squarely. This national reckoning, in Coates' view, can lead to a spiritual renewal in our country. As Jews, what I want to suggest in the time that remains tonight, we can gain insight into this discussion by recalling an earlier reparations debate, a debate about accepting reparations from West Germany for the Holocaust. The backgrounds for that debate was negotiations among West Germany, the US, Jewish NGOs, and the State of Israel concerning West Germany's admission to the United Nations and what they had to do in order to make that happen, who they had to give reparations to, and how much. This instigated a large debate in Israeli society about whether reparations should be accepted. There was not a question of whether the Germans were obligated to pay reparations. Everyone admitted that they certainly were, but whether Jews should even accept them. I was able to find in my research one of the few responsum, rabbinic decisions dealing with this questions of reparations, written by Reuven Katz, who was the chief rabbi of Petach Tikva in the 1950s. His responsum was called Reparations from the Kingdom of Amalek, which kind of is a very leading title. And I just want to pull out one excerpt from it. He writes, the destruction of Israel, the Jewish people, by the Nazis was so radical and complete that there is no field or property in which the blood of the martyrs has not mixed and in which the blood of the tortured of Israel has not dripped. It should not be claimed that the payments have absolutely no connection to atonement and forgiveness. First, the Germans themselves have linked the concept of payment with the concept of compensation, atonement, and forgiveness. All the negotiations with the Germans will be interpreted and recognized without reservation as reconciliation and forgiveness. Reuven Katz said that reparations should not be accepted because the payment is blood money. And by that he meant something literal, that the enslavement, the expropriation, the murder of Jews had seeped into the complete German national product, such that the money that would be given to the Jewish people would be the blood of their families and their ancestors. He also rejected it because of the equation of reparation with forgiveness. For him, reparation and forgiveness go hand in hand. And if we accept reparations, then it means that we are giving forgiveness. And he argues we cannot forgive. Lastly, he argues that Germany is an embodiment of the biblical Amalek, right, whose name must be erased. And so we cannot even enter into negotiations with them. Moshe Sharet, the future prime minister of the state of Israel, then the foreign minister, took a different view. He argued that reparations should be accepted. And he argued for this in a speech entitled Reparations, Permissible or Forbidden, Kosher or Non-Kosher. He wrote, "The state of Israel is saying, we are owed a debt by the country that exterminated 6 million Jews and plundered vast amounts of Jewish property. There is no repayment for the blood that was spilt. There is no forgiveness for the torture. But we must take the plundered property back from that country so that it does not remain in its hands, but instead will be devoted to the building of the state of Israel." And I want to focus on 3 points that Charette makes in this excerpt and in other pieces in his talk. First, against Katz, he argues that forgiveness and reparations can be distinguished from one another. Reparations does not equal forgiveness. And so we can accept reparations as the payment for an injustice that was done without saying that we've forgiven. Second, he argues that there's a parity of individual and collective claims. If individuals, as was already accepted, Jews can sue the German government to receive reparations, then the Jewish people can as well. If individuals can receive reparations, he argues, for their personal property and injury, then the Jewish people can receive reparations for Jewish property, injury, and death, even if they were not the people who were injured or whose property were expropriated or who was killed. In fact, he argues that the state of Israel is the heir of the Jewish people and should inherit the moral debt that's due to them by the German people. Of course, Katz and Charette are involved in a debate. They disagree with one another. Katz says that reparations must be rejected, while Charette says they can be accepted and they must be accepted. What I want to lift out is 3 thematic implications, 3 themes of this debate that can guide our own reflections. First and foremost, the complex relation between reparations and forgiveness, right? We need to think about, does reparations mean forgiveness? Is that our goal, or is it giving someone what they're due, trying to right a wrong? Second, what I call baked-in injustice, and that we saw in Katz's argument. What I mean by baked injustice is the way that injustice can permeate the foundations of an economy and a society such that everything and everyone in it is complicit in the injustice. Lastly, the last thematic implication I want to raise is the relationship between collective injury and collective responsibility. Not just this or that individual victim, but collective victims. Right? We're not talking about this or that victim of the Holocaust, but the Jewish people as the victim. So to not just this or that individual perpetrator, this or that German, Pole, SS member, but a collective perpetrator, the German people. The comparison between the German Jewish case and the American case is developed further by Susan Neiman in her recent book, Learning from the Germans, Race and Memory of Evil, where she draws on Coates, but also reflects further on the German Jewish experience. She argues, here drawing on Coates, and here I'm going to quote, that any serious discussion of American reparations for slavery must acknowledge 2 facts. America's wealth is intrinsically bound up with profits from slavery, from the plantations of the South to the factories in the North. That's the first point. Second, chattel slavery was abolished in 1865, but was replaced by other forms of subjugation that were not just a function of custom and prejudice, but a matter of law. So Neiman argues, like Coates, we need to properly scope what we're talking about reparations. We're not just talking about slavery that ended in 1865, but we're talking about something that's built in injustice, baked in injustice into our society, and that had a legacy up into this day. Second, as Coates argues, she suggests that we need to disambiguate corrective and distributive justice. And she offers a very good illustration of this. Imagine a survivor of the Holocaust who currently lives in Germany. Germany that has a very robust social welfare state, right? Has a good public health system, has worked to sustain economic equality. We would still say that that Holocaust survivor was due something more, something as reparations, right, for the Holocaust. corrective justice as opposed to distributive justice. So too, Nyman argues, we have many good things that we're trying to achieve in our society, many just things, right, in order to make our society more egalitarian. That is a separate issue from the debt that we need to repay for slavery and its legacy. Last 2 points. Nyman points out that reparations and acknowledgement of wrongdoing in the case of Germany preceded the development of a culture of memory and atonement for the Holocaust. Reparations and the acknowledgement as the beginning, as opposed to the end of a process of what's called in Germany, Vergangenheitsaufarbeiten. In Germany, there are steps in the ground, memorials for people that were deported. Memory of the Holocaust is part of the public educational system. What Nyman points out is that these are more recent developments. Reparations happened in 1950 when many people didn't want it to happen. And it happened in a complex and messy political environment. But what Nyman points out is that that work, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and an attempt to repay made possible the development of a culture of memory and atonement. Lastly, what Nyman urges us to think about is citizenship as responsibility. Someone might say, I only recently came to this country. What does this injustice that happened in 1865 or that happened in the early 20th century or that happened in 1970 or that happened in 1990, what does it have to do with me? What Nyman points out is that citizenship is not just a bundle of rights. It is the responsibility for a nation's past. I grew up in New York City, and I remember in Midtown, there was a big sign that said, your share of the national debt, and it was counting, up. Right? A lot of that debt that financial debt was accrued long before I was born, right? Long before many people came to this country. And yet I am still bound by it, right? Through taxes, and maybe hopefully one day we'll repay it. Nyman argues that this is how we need to think about our moral debt. When we take up the identity of American citizen, we are taking up a responsibility for our past. I've talked a lot about responsibility tonight. Responsibility for the Jewish tradition, responsibility as American citizens. I want to close with reflective questions. As I said, not with answers, but with questions. First and foremost, how, if at all, can there be corrective justice for genocide or enslavement? How can we repay that type of injustice? Who is responsible for it, and to whom is it owed? I distinguished between the question of reparation and forgiveness. Can genocide or enslavement ever be forgiven? And should it? What role or responsibility should Jews have in reckoning with America's legacy of racial oppression? And finally, what resources can the Jewish tradition offer, and what are its limitations? How can we take responsibility both for the Jewish tradition and for the Jewish tradition and our identities as American citizens? I want to close with just suggestions for further reading. These are also in the handouts. David Goldenberg's The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity and Islam, which is a magisterial work. Abraham Melammed's The Image of Black in Jewish Culture, A History of the Other, which goes beyond the text discussed by Goldenberg. Albert Memme's Racism, from which I drew tonight. And finally, Susan Nyman's recent book, which I've also discussed, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brafman. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We have a few more minutes. The first question I have, what is the origin of the term Jim Crow?
So that's a question for American historians. I am a historian of the Jewish tradition. There are many other people who can trace that much better than I can. So I'll defer to the experts here.
Can I answer that question?
You can.
There was a minstrel show song called Jump Jim Crow. And it was humiliated a black man who was dancing for the entertainment of white people.
Very good. Thank you.
This was in popular culture, and this was something that Black people would recognize, but also white people who went to minstrel shows would also recognize it.
Excellent. So are there any questions that, after that great explanation from Richard Siegel, are there anything that I can draw from my expertise to answer?
I have another one in the chat. Apologies for the question asker. There's a little more text, so I'm just going to try to distill it. If we take seriously the historical material production of race, then what more can be said about whiteness other than that it is reducibly synonymous to racism as such? What is the current discourse on Jewish identity's amalgamation with whiteness and efforts to extricate ourselves from the white supremacist project?
Excellent. So first, I'm going to start out with an article suggestion. I'm forgetting the title of the Schaub. There's a great article called White Jews by David Schaub, I think, from AJS Perspectives. That's very good on the idea of white Jews and kind of taking seriously both the idea of how European Jews were kind of let into, the white club, and also the way in which kind of they still remain Jews and can be kind of othered as Jews within that. So that's just a reading suggestion there. Yeah, I think we need to take seriously the, again, social construction of race, how whiteness is whiteness as kind of a generalizing category, right, over and above European Jew, Irish, Scot, English, so on and so forth, is a feature of racial supremacy. And that we should use it as a critical category, right, to recognize it, right, in the way in which it functions to promote inequality and discrimination, and then to break it down, right, to dismantle it, not so that people are left with no identity, but that they can have other identities that are more diverse and that aren't racially homogenizing and that don't have kind of their sole focus in supporting white supremacy.
Thank you so much. We just have another minute, so I have no more questions in the chat. And so in a moment, we'll be returning to the main session for the closing session. Thank you all so much.
Great. And I encourage people, if you have any questions at some other time, you can email me at yobrafman@jtsa.edu. But you can also Google me and you'll find my JTS page, yobrafman@jtsa.edu, if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you very much.